Joining us right now via phone is Dr. Nathaneil Jeanson. He has a book called Traced, Human DNA's Big Surprise. Good morning to you, Dr. Jeanson.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Praise be to Jesus. We're glad you're here. I went through your book. I went through the audio book form when I was on a big road trip. Utterly fascinated by this book. Truly interesting. And I wish we had hours to dive into the heavy details. Unfortunately, we only have 20 minutes. So let's get started. Let me get the sort of the housekeeping out of the way here. What is DNA and how does DNA actually, like when you, as a scientist, when you look at this, how does it actually tell us any information about our past?
Yeah, so DNA is basically the substance of heredity, that part of us that encodes hair color, eye color, height, all sorts of physical features. And the way we can tell our past is, at least what I try to show in the book Traced, is the main tool I use is the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. And this Y chromosome, male inherited DNA, changes every generation. It gets copied in sperm cells from dad to son here. It gets copied imperfectly. And so this accumulation of genetic mistakes, of errors, is something we can identify and track with time. And so this becomes then a marker, a surrogate marker for a family tree. We can track who we come from and how long ago we came from a certain person. So you can compare my DNA to yours, count the number of differences, and say, okay, approximately this many generations ago, we last shared a common ancestor. And so comparing that sort of data from men around the globe allows us to reconstruct the family tree for all of humanity around the globe.
And so what's the error factor in DNA research? Like, how much of a margin are we talking about?
I'd say it all depends on the type of DNA you're looking at. There's some compartments, like the female inherited DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, where the error rate is like, or I should say the uncertainty is 25%. So you could compare my mitochondrial DNA to your mitochondrial DNA. So even though it's just ladies who pass it on, men and women both have it. And we might say, okay, you have a common ancestor with me, 500 AD approximately, but it could have been 500 BC or 1500 AD, and so this huge variety makes it almost impossible to do any sort of detailed historical analysis. Whereas the Y chromosome, you could compare mine to yours and say, okay, we have a common ancestor in AD 500, plus or minus maybe 100 years, 200 years, much more precise, and say, okay, it corresponds to this historical era, these historical peoples. It's a very fine detail, not quite as detailed as written historical records, but it's a pretty good approximation.
Now, I want to get to one of the big issues in regards to looking at DNA, the history of origins of peoples and time. I just saw an article yesterday out of the SciTech Daily. The headline said, "Human ancestor fossils in the, quote, cradle of mankind, close quote, may be more than 1 million years older than thought." I mean, this is very typical. We see this all the time. It's taught in every grade school, high school, college. We're all trained to think of time in a huge scale. But what does DNA tell us, and the study of DNA tell us about the scale of time?
I'd say if you look in human DNA in particular, and we could expand this to other species, the rate at which DNA changes is far too fast to be consistent with an ancient time scale that we learn in school. Hundreds of thousands of years for humans, millions of years for other species. It's just mutating too quickly. The converse of that, so the flip side of that, it's not just an hey, this typical time scale doesn't work, but it fits very closely with what I'd say the Bible talks about in terms of human history, about the history of the whole universe. It all goes back just a few thousand years. You can see that, and so the main focus again of the book is the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. You can trace that back to Noah about 4,500 years ago to his 3 sons. You can see multiple independent lines of evidence pointing towards the exact biblical anthropology. And I have another book that I wrote a few years earlier to this called Replacing Darwin, where I look at the genetic data from more than just humans, other species, and they all show this same consistent pattern. The rate of change in DNA is way too fast for the mainstream timescale, yet when you say, okay, what should we expect to see in light of the biblical timescale, then you see the numbers line up exactly.
Well, this was another part of the book that I really appreciated that you did, and that was you sort of addressed some of these major issues. Like, for instance, why then wouldn't an archaeologist agree with these findings? Or why wouldn't a geologist? Why do geologists look at the Earth and say, oh, look, it literally and very clearly looks so old? Why would DNA tell a different story than some of those other disciplines?
Yes, I'd say there's two parts to this answer. There's the different ways these different fields do their analyses, and then there's some underlying common assumptions that kind of blow up the whole debate. So if you look at, and this is drawing on what my geology and astronomy and paleontology colleagues have told me, if you look at how the long-age timescales are calculated, the methods that they use, the assumptions that they use in geology, astronomy, and so on, the key assumption in all of this is that the present is the key to the past. If we, for example, measure the rate today at which the Colorado River erodes the Grand Canyon, very slow rate, and then if you assume that slow rate of erosion has been consistent all throughout the Grand Canyon's history, you get a very ancient age for the origin of the Grand Canyon. All that changes, of course, if you say, well, how would that calculation differ if we, for example, allowed for the possibility of a global flood or some sort of large catastrophe, in which, by definition, the present rates of change would be different from the rates of change in the past, in which a global flood, let's say, or some sort of large catastrophe would dramatically accelerate the rate of change. That, of course, then leads to a very different conclusion. So there's this backstory of underlying assumptions that have undergirded the mainstream timescale for a very long time, and in which the mainstream community has insisted on basically from the outset excluding the possibility of a global flood or some sort of catastrophic change. Now you apply those same assumptions to genetics, where we can measure the rate of change in DNA today, compare father's DNA to son's DNA, mother's DNA to daughter's DNA. How fast or slow does it change? In this case, the change is very quick. And now the very same community that has for decades insisted that the present rates of change are the key to the past now says, well, we can't do that in genetics because it gives us a very different answer than what we're seeing in geology and astronomy. There must have been a slower rate of change in times past. So there's a little bit of an inconsistency here that I think is key to understanding how to resolve these various fields. I would say that I think if you say, well, what if we just, from the outset, allow for the possibility of changing rates of DNA or of geologic change? Which one makes the most sense? I'd say from the outset, young Earth creationists have had, for a long time, a very clear catastrophe at hand that could play a role in geology, whereas the same thing doesn't necessarily apply to DNA. So I would say the young Earth creationists have a valid reason to say, hey, what if there was a different rate of change in geology, whereas there's no such a priori reason to invoke something like that in genetics? Then I look at the mainstream community and say, okay, give me a rational, consistent, coherent reason why one assumption works in this case but doesn't work in the other. Otherwise, it looks just sort of arbitrary, willy-nilly. And I have yet to hear a good explanation for why the mainstream community can invoke different rates of change in different fields other than just, well, because we've got this preconceived conclusion.
What was the most fascinating thing that you discovered during your research and preparing for this book?
So if I would ask you, so to answer your question, the one thing that I found most fascinating are these three, to sort of paraphrase
Sure. Go for
one of
it.
my friends. I'd say I never anticipated finding such revolutionary insights into the pre-Columbian Americas. So in short, the book shows that based on genetics, the peoples of the Americas underwent multiple settlings. There were multiple migrations from Eurasia in the pre-Columbian world, so much so that it looks like the later migrations, the later peoples replaced those who came before. So I learned next to nothing about the pre-Columbian Americas growing up, and so never in my wildest dreams did I think that I'd one day be making discoveries that rewrite this history in a dramatic way. Also being able to find the genealogical echo of Genesis 10, Noah, his 3 boys, the details of Genesis 10, Shem's genealogy going down 6 generations, and Ham's going down 4. These sorts of things, I don't think I anticipated that either. In fact, that discovery was made partway through this process. And then just to be able to see the echo of human history pop out of our DNA over and over again is just remarkable and sets the stage for all sorts of research going forward. So there have just been multiple aspects that have sort of taken me aback and were things I didn't anticipate to find, but have been a really thrilling ride to see this pop out over and over again.
Now, just for clarity and for the listeners' sake, pre-Columbian, so Columbus sailed the ocean in 1492, right? So the discovery of the Americas in 1492 by Europe, or so to speak. Well, that's what we're talking about. So what happened before he ever sailed is really the question. And I have to say that was one of the most fascinating aspects of your work, was because I love history. I'm a big history geek, and I like to study all of these stories and to re-look at American history from a new perspective. I found that utterly fascinating. You know, to see that these immigrations of peoples coming into the continent well before Europeans and the way that we know them, and then, you know, sort of pushing out existing peoples, and what did that look like? And that didn't happen all that long ago. Again, going back to the scale of time, that blew my mind. I mean, even as like, what was the soonest that a peoples came into the Americas that not related to Spain or anything like that? How far back are we talking here?
Yeah, so if we use the 1492 arrival of Columbus and Europeans as the anchor point, you go back just a few centuries prior to that, around 1000 A.D., there was another group that came over not from Europe, but from Eurasia, probably the Siberia, Central Asia area, about 1000 A.D. This could have been, let's say, the Athabascan people. So you think today of the Navajos, the Apaches. They belong to a language grouping called the Athabascans that are primarily found up in northern Canada, Alaska. This may have been their migration. Prior to that, you have another migration of peoples in the AD 300s to 600s. This is an era of history, and just as a side note here, this is one of the most exciting aspects to me of this study. This is an era of human history where we know there have been something was stirring in Central Asia. You've got the Huns migrating into the Roman Empire, into Europe, overthrowing them. You've got in the east, you've got the Han Dynasty falling, then you've got other Central Asians migrating in. It's around that exact same time that another group migrates into the Americas, again connected to this what's called, I guess, mainstream history, the Völkerwanderung, a German word meaning the great wandering of peoples. Another group comes over, and shortly thereafter you see the downfall of the classic era civilization in the Americas, the Mayans. And we don't yet have genetic data to know who the Mayans came from, but that would have been a separate settling, and perhaps even a fourth settling would have been the Olmecs, one of the cradles of civilizations. So there have been multiple migrations from Asia over into the Americas, and what's perhaps even more exciting to me is you have native accounts, like the Delaware Indian account, the Choctaw, Chickasaw accounts, that are consistent with this genetic history. And in fact, one of the results of the book coming out and us releasing some videos, I've had Native Americans contact me. We've got a Native American study group going on right now, a couple of Navajos, Cree, Yupik in Alaska, Cherokee, saying we want to dig into this more, synthesize our accounts of what we've said, who we come from, when we come from, along with the genetics to basically come up with a comprehensive step-by-step history for the Americas before Columbus. This is, again, something I never had in school. I feel like most people who grew up in the United States don't have in school. This is something we're breaking wide open.
That is so fascinating to think that we could trace all of that back through, as you said, through the father's DNA, and that really opens up a lot of implications. You know, it really proves the biblical timeline here. But I have a question here from one of our listeners. He says he read a book many years ago that, and in this book he says that we were descended from two people, obviously with Adam and Eve. And the author stated that within 12 generations that we would have varied melanin levels that we see today. Is that indeed the case, is his question. What do you say, Dr. Jeanson?
I'd say it's even sooner than that. The genetic model I've been advancing probably since about 2016 is if you look at our DNA, not just the male DNA, not just the Y chromosome, not just the female inherited DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, but the vast majority of our DNA that we get from both parents, and you try to dial that clock backwards, what it seems to be consistent with is that God created Adam and Eve with a whole lot of genetic diversity from the start. So I have two versions of my DNA because I have two parents. They're not brother, sister. They have different DNA. So my DNA is a mix of my parents. My facial features look like a mix of my parents. All of us basically have the same story. And I'm arguing that if you dial that DNA back to the beginning, you arrive at a conclusion that Adam and Eve also have, in a sense, the appearance of parents, that God gives Adam two different versions of his DNA. Eve is created from his side, and she has two different versions of her DNA. And so from the beginning, they have the capacity to produce a whole diversity of peoples from the start, what we'd call Asian, African, European, red, yellow, black, and white. They would have a whole diversity of offspring right away, the ability to be fruitful and multiply and have a whole spectrum of peoples, this would have been normal, I argue, back in their time, back in the days of Noah as well, and only after Babel, when God comes in and confuses their languages, forces them to spread out, and they migrate according to language group, do some of these so-called racial and ethnic features begin to coalesce around a common theme, and you have sort of an Asian appearance, an African appearance, these sorts of things. But the capacity for racial change to occur in the generational blink of an eye still exists to this day and would have been present from the very beginning.
Yeah, amen. That's another one of those things that I thought was just utterly fascinating about the book, of how linked we are, how not different we are to each other on a DNA level. But today we especially in the news, there's so much talk about racism and this and that, and there's only one race, it's the human race. Let me ask you this, because we're getting down to the clock here. So when you layered on top of your study of DNA, the biblical timeline, the genealogies found in Genesis post-Noah, and then, of course, your layer another top, which was the big historical events, the Huns, the Ottoman Turks, and how this sort of correlated to the data, the Indian accounts, the Native American Indian accounts that you referenced. I find that utterly fascinating. But Shem, Ham, and Japheth, can you summarize for us really quickly, what were their descendants' migration? And generally speaking, where did the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth end up?
I'd say the short answer is it's all extremely messy, where there's been multiple migrations all throughout history, and it's very difficult to predict what someone's history is if they come to me. Hey, I'm a Norwegian. Hey, I'm of Turkish descent. Hey, I'm of Iranian descent or of Chinese descent. What's my history? I'll say, well, it's rather messy because humans have been migrating all throughout their history. So, just as a general rule, though, I'd say that the descendants of Japheth, one of the main genealogical echoes we have, is of the early European peoples. However, this is a good example, again, of the messiness of history. The vast majority of Europeans today, or people of European descent, are not from Japheth, but likely from Shem, down through his offspring, or I should say, I forget if it's his great-greater. One of those descendants, Joktan and his sons. Most Europeans come from one of Joktan's sons. This is the technical term is haplogroup R1b, R1a, but basically they're migrants from Central Asia. They came into Europe around the Middle Ages, and for whatever reason have simply reproduced more, had more male offspring, and so I'm of Central Asian descent. I've had my Y chromosome tested. The vast majority of Western Europeans, Eastern Europeans, all come from recent Central Asian migrants via Shem, not through Japheth, and this sort of population movement, replacement, differential reproduction, this is the rule wherever you go in the globe. And so you want to find out what your history is, the Y chromosome, and this applies to ladies too. If they find a male relative, their father, their brother, some sort of male relative, they can find their sort of history as well. So wherever you go in the globe, it's a messy history. I forgot to mention Ham here as well. Many of his offspring are the sub-Saharan Africans, but it's not just that. You have Siberians who are from Ham. You have Japanese who are from Ham. So there's all sorts of unpredictability all over the globe, all over the map, yet it's consistent with what the scriptures say about the descendants of these three boys. And this sort of unity is really exciting to me, and also sets the stage for the discovery of even more lineages going forward into the future.
We're down to about a minute now. I've seen headlines and studies in the news in the past few years that DNA studies have suggested we go back to one man, but he was not the original. It goes even further. We would call that Noah and Adam. What do the secular studies, what do the secular scientists believe about this information?
They would say that there was never a point in human history when the population was just two people. They'd say, yes, the Y chromosome Adam individual is this one guy that all these lineages go back to, but he was not the only man alive. There were other men who were his contemporaries. They just didn't leave offspring whose genealogy descends to this day. So there's a very explicit denial of Adam and Eve, of Noah and his family. In the mainstream literature, there's many theistic evolutionists, people who believe God used evolution, who've been making this prominent. So the contradiction between mainstream science and the biblical record grows stronger each year, and I'd say is all the more relevant to those who hold the scriptures as true. This is what genetics brings to the table. It's not something we've seen in times past, but this is the type of argument that's now being advanced. And I would say the genetic data actually are consistent with scriptures. They're not consistent with mainstream science, but they are consistent with what God has revealed in the scriptures, and this gives great reassurance to those who hold to it as true.
How much do we know based on we have just a sliver of the DNA evidence? We still have a lot more to go, I imagine.
I'd say about 99% of the people on the globe still have not taken a DNA test, but the evidence that we do have is strongly consistent with what the Bible says.
All right. The book is called Traced: Human DNA's Big Surprise. I recommend it. You should check it out. Dr. Nathaneil Jeanson, God bless you. God love you. Have a great day, sir.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for hour number 1. Thank you for joining us. We enjoyed that. If you can and are able to, join us in the next hour. David L. Gray will be on to talk about Nancy Pelosi receiving communion and the Pope's new encyclical, his letter. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.